Master Chappaletto was a villain of a man. He was a notary by trade, and in the Middle Ages, notaries were responsible for drafting documents that set the terms for state and commercial transactions, which was important, but the notary could also do great mischief if he was corrupt like this one was. Boccaccio says of Chappaletto, being a scrivener, he thought very great shame when as any of his instruments was found, and indeed he drew few such, other than false, and worse than a professional crook. Many a time, of his proper choice, he had been known to wound men, and do them to death with his own hand. He was a very glutton and a great wine-bibber, a notorious gamester and a caster of cogged dice. Indeed, he was belike the worst man that ever was born. But when he was sent to Burgundy on business, he became fatally ill there, and in his deathbed confession he told a bullshit story about having led this incredibly pious life of almsgiving, humility, and fasting, and so when he died, because the priest believed him, they referred to him as a saint, and Boccaccio writes, they styled him, and yet style him, Saint Chappaletto, and avouch that God through him hath wrought many miracles. So a wicked man is determined to be a saint and a worker of wonders in France. That's the first story. In the second story of the Decameron, a Parisian Jew makes a promise to his Christian friend that he will convert to the Catholic faith if, during his visit to Rome, he finds that the Pope and the cardinals live a manner of life which is one of goodly Christian charity. What he finds in Rome is the very opposite. He found all, from the highest to the lowest, most shamefully given to the sin of lust, without any restraint of remorse or shamefastness, insomuch that the interest of courtesans and catamites was of no small avail there in obtaining any considerable thing. So if you need something in Rome, talk to a prostitute. Additionally, he saw them all covetous and greedy after money, insomuch that human, nay, Christian blood, they sold and bought indifferently for a price, making a greater traffic and having more brokers thereof than folk at Paris of silks. And with lines like these, Boccaccio paints the officials of the church as having no bridle of conscience, nor any shame that their covetousness is so easily perceived. And yet, the conclusion of the writer, even having described the accidental veneration of the vicious Saint Chappaletto, as well as the unbounded perversity of the cardinals, Boccaccio says that these things are infallible proof of God's benignness and of his compassionate liberality towards us. So let's look at how Boccaccio extracts this positive view. As to the case of Chappaletto, who was considered a saint despite his wickedness in life, he was prayed unto in death, as though his spirit had the ear of God. But Boccaccio does not doubt that God answered some of those prayers anyway, because God does not care if honest worship proceeds from a mistaken fact, such as this. Boccaccio writes, God's benignness regardeth not our errors, when they proceed from that which is beyond our ken, and having regard rather to the purity of the suppliant's intent. More interesting, though, is the Jewish merchant and his visit to Rome. This man who was prepared to convert to Christianity, had he found the culture of Rome to be commendable, he converts anyway, even though he finds it to be utterly debased. And this is how he puts it. This is his rationale for his conversion, despite seeing such evil. As far as I can judge, meseemeth your chief pastor, that's the Pope, and consequently all the others, endeavor with all diligence and all their wit and every art to bring to naught and banish from the world the Christian religion, whereas they should be its foundation and support. And for that I see that this, whereafter they strive, cometh not to pass, but that your religion continually increaseth, and waxeth still brighter and more glorious, Meseemeth I manifestly discern that the Holy Spirit is verily the foundation and support thereof. I now tell thee frankly that for nothing in the world would I forbear to become a Christian. Now we're setting aside the implication of one religion being any better than another. In the third story of the Decameron, it is declared to be unknowable whether or not any of the religions are better than any of the others. But a more important concept is at work here in the second story, which is this, that the example of bad living set by the cardinals and pope fails to misguide the proper faithful from the better path, but rather the virtuous soul has the ability to reject and refuse to imitate the negative impressions that it sees. Boccaccio says this of the purpose of the second story: I mean to show you how goodness, bearing patiently with the shortcomings of those who should be its faithful witness in deed and word, draws from them contrariwise evidence of his infallible truth, to the end that what we believe we may with more assured conviction follow. I switched to the Rig translation for those lines. For the rest of it, I'm using the Payne. The shortcomings of the clergy give proof through their negative example of what goodness is. Now recall the words of Abraham, the Jewish merchant, after he had said that the church seems to be trying to rid the world of Christianity. But because this fails to come about, he says, meseemeth I manifestly discern that the Holy Spirit is verily the foundation and support thereof. And the interpretation of this, I think, is that the total abdication by the clergy of adhering to any instructive purpose means that whenever a good Christian is encountered, their devoutness cannot be rationally attributed to an institutional source. So their goodness must be derived from some untaught source, which leads them with all the more assured conviction. And so we can see where Boccaccio falls on that age-old question on the origin of goodness, namely, whether virtue can be taught as by a teacher to a student like a science, or whether it cannot be so taught. Socrates, for example, believed and repeatedly argued that virtue could not be taught. Socrates says this in Meno: virtue is found to be neither natural nor taught, but is imparted to us by a divine dispensation without understanding in those who receive it. And Boccaccio would seem to agree with Socrates when he writes, God's especial grace, it is not to be believed, descendeth unto us and upon us by any merit of our own, but of the proper motion of his own benignity, which is to say, that humans cannot learn their way to goodness. Instead, the benignity of God, planted in the soul by divine dispensation, perseveres even in a vicious environment, and far from believing that the enrichment of the wicked is a knock against the justice of God, Boccaccio would prove the reverse, that even when vice is so empowered, it cannot, even with every effort, banish virtue from the earth.